I was 17 the last time I saw my Uncle Samuel, and even then he was already halfway gone, not dead, but vanished into that peculiar space where living men become legends, whispered about at family gatherings but never truly known. He left our world quietly, the way morning mist retreats from valley floors, and I learned of his death not through tears or telephone calls, but through a formal letter from the Indian government, stamped and clinical, informing me that I was the sole inheritor of his estate somewhere in the Himalayan reaches where maps grow vague and cellular signals surrender to ancient silence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that tasted like copper and coming snow, and tucked inside the official documents was something else, photocopies of journal pages, just fragments really, written in Samuel's unmistakable hand. That spidery script that always looked like it was trying to escape the page. The words made no immediate sense. References to obligations and promises, to something he called the last keeper of the old pact, and a single line underscored 3 times, "When I am gone, the responsibility cannot die with me." I read those pages 17 times that first night, and with each reading the silence in my apartment grew heavier, as though his words were filling the room with the weight of mountains I had never seen. The second letter came 3 days later, and this one carried a different kind of authority: Federal Wildlife Enforcement Conservation Bureau, the kind of official terminology that turns inherited property into something resembling a crime scene. They were asking questions about Samuel's supply orders spanning for decades, about unusual purchases flagged in customs records, about satellite thermal imaging that showed heat signatures inconsistent with a single elderly occupant in a structure that size. They were polite, professionally curious, but beneath the courtesy, I sensed something else, that peculiar hunger that comes when people believe they're close to discovering something the world has declared impossible. The agent's name was Devon Cars, and his signature looked like a slash across the page, and he requested my presence at the property for what he termed a state assessment and regulatory compliance review. I remember standing at my kitchen window, watching clouds gather above the city, holding both letters in my hands and feeling as though I stood at the edge of a precipice I couldn't yet see, only sense in the way the air pressure changes before a storm arrives. I flew into Darradon 6 days after Samuel's body was discovered by a supply runner who'd grown concerned after 3 months of silence, then spent another full day in vehicles that grew progressively smaller and less certain. As roads became suggestions scratched into mountainsides, the house appeared suddenly round a bend where prayer flags hung motionless in thin air, a stone structure that seemed to have grown from the mountain rather than been built upon it, perched at an elevation where breathing becomes a conscious act and the sky presses down with a clarity that makes you understand why people come to these heights seeking gods. But this was no monastery, no spiritual retreat painted in welcoming ochres and reds. Samuel's home looked like a fortress, like something built to keep the world out or perhaps to keep something else in. And as I approached on foot, my guide refusing to come closer, I noticed details that transformed curiosity into unease. The windows were small, reinforced, the kind you see in structures built to withstand sieges. The doors were metal beneath their wooden facades, and the walls were thick enough to house secrets in their very bones. The key they'd given me felt heavy with more than mere metal as I stood before that door. Wind carrying sounds that might have been distant avalanches or might have been something else entirely. Something breathing in the spaces between rock and sky. The supply runner's statement mentioned in the federal letter had described the scene inside as undisturbed but strange, noting that Samuel appeared to have died peacefully in his chair, journal open on his lap, but that the house contained enough preserved food to supply a small expedition, and that some of the interior doors bore marks. He couldn't explain: deep gouges in hardwood, scores in metal, the kind of damage that spoke of force and desperation, and something trying very hard to either escape or be heard. I turned the key, felt the bolt slide back with a sound like a decision being made, and stepped across the threshold into my uncle's final secret, into a mystery that would force me to choose between the comfortable blindness of the modern world and a truth so profound it could only have survived in silence, protected by one man's impossible promise made 4 decades ago in these same thin-aired heights where heaven and earth negotiate their uncertain border. The interior revealed itself in layers, each one deepening my confusion about who Samuel had truly been in those lost decades after he disappeared from family memory into these mountains. The main room was ascetic, almost monastic. A single chair, worn to the shape of his body, A table scarred with use. Shelves lined with books in languages I recognized and several I didn't. Their spines cracked from repeated reading. But it was the infrastructure beneath this simplicity that unsettled me. The way an archaeologist might feel discovering a temple beneath a humble shrine. The doors were indeed reinforced, not just the entrance but every interior door, fitted with bolts that belonged on bank vaults. And the pantry revealed itself as something closer to a bunker. Rows upon rows of preserved foods, dried goods, supplies enough for years of isolation or for feeding something with an appetite that exceeded one elderly man's modest needs. I moved through the rooms with my heart climbing into my throat, touching surfaces that felt both familiar and alien, seeing evidence of my uncle's daily life layered over something else, some other purpose that transformed domesticity into dedication, routine into ritual, solitude into guardianship of a secret that had required his entire life to maintain. The marks came next, and they stopped me cold in the narrow hallway connecting the main room to what appeared to be Samuel's sleeping quarters. Deep scores in the wooden doorframe, running vertically at a height well above my head, gouges that spoke of claws or talons drawn down with force or perhaps with longing, with the desperate communication of something that couldn't speak, but needed desperately to be heard. I knelt to examine the lower markings and found them different, more deliberate, almost careful, as though whatever made them had learned restraint over time, had discovered that destruction was less effective than precision. The wood around these marks was worn smooth, touched repeatedly, and I realized with a chill that traveled the length of my spine that these weren't the signs of captivity or aggression but of habitation, of a presence that had lived here long enough to leave its signature in the very bones of the structure. On the floor nearby, barely visible in the fading light coming through those narrow windows, I found a tuft of white fur, coarse and thick, caught in a gap between floorboards. I picked it up with trembling fingers, feeling its texture, its weight, its absolute strangeness, and understood that I was holding evidence of something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that every rational part of my mind insisted was impossible even as my hands told me otherwise. Samuel's bedroom offered no comfort, only deeper mysteries wrapped in the mundane details of an old man's final days. His bed was neatly made, military corners, the kind of discipline that spoke of routine maintained until the very end, but beside it stood a second chair, positioned, facing the bed, worn in a different pattern, and on the table between them sat 2 cups, as though he'd taken tea with a visitor whose presence required no explanation, whose company was so familiar that evidence of it needed no concealing. The journal they'd mentioned in the federal letter lay on the nightstand, leather-bound and thick with years of entries, bookmarked at a page dated just 3 days before his death. I reached for it with hands that felt disconnected from my body, opened it to where his fingers had last rested, and read words that seemed to pulse with urgency. I am failing, and you know it. Old friend, forgive me for breaking the silence between us with such obvious truth, but we must face what comes next. The pact was made for my lifetime, and my lifetime is ending. What becomes of promises when the promiser can no longer keep them? What becomes of you? The handwriting grew shakier in the final lines, but the emotion remained clear. A tenderness that transformed this journal from mere record into love letter, into farewell addressed to someone or something that had shared these heights and this solitude for longer than most marriages last. I stood in that bedroom as daylight surrendered to dusk outside, holding my uncle's final thoughts, feeling the weight of the house around me like a living thing. And that's when I heard it, a sound that seemed to rise from the mountain itself, deep and mournful, a vocalization that was neither animal nor human, but something that existed in the space between, carrying in its tones the kind of grief that doesn't require language to be understood. It came from below, from somewhere beneath the foundation I stood upon, and I felt it in my chest, before my ears fully registered it, a vibration that spoke of sighs and sorrow and something waiting in darkness for an answer that would never come. My body made the decision before my mind caught up, feet moving toward the sound, hands running along walls searching for seams, for hidden mechanisms, for the passage that must exist because this house was built around a secret and secrets require places of concealment. I found it behind a bookshelf in what I'd taken for a storage closet, the wall itself false, painted to match, but revealing hinges when pressed at the correct angle, swinging back to expose a descending staircase carved from living rock, its walls covered in symbols I recognized from Tibetan manuscripts. Prayers and warnings and promises written in a script that predated the modern world. Protective wards surrounding a passage that led down into the mountain's heart where something impossible waited in the darkness, grieving for the only friend it had ever known. The descent felt less like walking and more like being swallowed, the stone steps worn smooth by decades of passage, the air growing colder and denser with each footfall, carrying scents that didn't belong to any cellar I'd ever known. Animal musk, yes, but also something herbal, almost medicinal, and beneath that the smell of earth undisturbed for centuries, of cave systems and underground rivers, of a world that existed parallel to the surface but remained forever separate from it. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, though I knew this was just a trick of my failing light and accelerating heartbeat. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that they were responding to my presence, acknowledging me as I passed, judging whether I had the right to continue into the sanctum they had been placed to protect. I counted 47 steps before the staircase opened into a chamber, and in that moment of transition, from passage to space, I felt the weight of the mountain above me, the millions of tons of stone and snow and silence pressing down, and understood that Samuel had built not just a hiding place but a temple, a sacred space carved from geology and consecrated with purpose, that had consumed his entire adult life. The sound came again, closer now, resonating in the enclosed space, and I froze at the threshold between stairs and chamber, my flashlight beam trembling across walls that had been smoothed and painted, transformed from raw cave into dwelling, into home. The habitat revealed itself in that shaking light like a photograph developing in reverse, details emerging from darkness into impossible clarity. The space was vast, far larger than the house's footprint above, extending back into natural cavern systems that Samuel must have discovered and then adapted, connected, transformed into living quarters that spoke of deep understanding and deeper commitment. I saw furniture ranged with care, a massive bed constructed from logs and layered with furs and blankets, a feeding area with bowls the size of wash basins, shelves built into the rock face holding items I couldn't immediately identify but which suggested decades of accumulated life, of birthdays and seasons and quiet moments of companionship celebrated in secrecy and solitude. Heating elements had been installed with obvious expertise, their vents camouflaged but effective, maintaining a temperature that felt almost tropical compared to the surface cold, creating an environment that spoke of tropical origins, of a species adapted to different altitudes or perhaps different epochs, refugees from a climate that no longer existed. The walls were decorated, there was no other word for it, covered with Samuel's sketches and paintings, images of the same figure rendered over and over across what must have been years, showing growth and aging, showing relationship evolving from wary distance to intimate proximity, a visual diary of friendship that couldn't be acknowledged in daylight or explained to the world above. And there, in the farthest corner where the natural cave darkness gathered thickest, I saw movement, saw white for catching my light, saw massive shoulders rising and falling with breathing that sounded like wind through mountain passes. The Yeti turned its head slowly, as though the motion required consideration, as though it had learned that sudden movements created fear and fear destroyed the fragile bridges that connection required. I should have run, every instinct screamed for it, but instead I stood transfixed by eyes that caught my flashlight beam and reflected it back, not with the flat shine of animal tapetum but with something deeper, more complex, an intelligence that assessed and understood and recognized grief in me because grief was what it was currently drowning in. The face was broader than human, the features flatter, yet arranged in expressions I could read despite their alien architecture. Loss, exhaustion, a weariness that went beyond physical tiredness into the realm of existential fatigue. The look of someone who has outlived their purpose and now faces an uncertain future. White fur covered the visible body, thick and somewhat unkempt, with the slight yellowing that speaks of age, and the hands, I couldn't think of them as paws, rested on knees drawn up in a posture that was remarkably human, vulnerable, the position of someone waiting for news they know will be terrible. Around its neck hung a pendant I recognized from photographs of Samuel as a young man, a family heirloom our grandmother had given him before his first expedition, now transferred to a creature that represented everything his scientific training should have rejected, but which his heart had apparently embraced completely. It made no aggressive motion, showed no territoriality, simply watched me with those profound eyes, and in the silence between us I felt Samuel's absence like a physical presence, The ghost of the man who had bridged our two worlds now departed, leaving behind to beings who shared nothing except the loss of him. I found my voice, though it came out fractured and uncertain, shaped more by emotion than intention. "He's gone," I said, stating the obvious because sometimes grief requires the articulation of what everyone already knows, needs the words spoken aloud to make the unbearable real. The Yeti's response was immediate and devastating, a sound that started deep in that massive chest and rose through registers of sorrow I didn't know existed. A keening that contained no words but needed none, communicating loss in frequencies that bypassed language entirely, and struck directly at whatever neural pathways process empathy and shared pain. Tears came to my own eyes, unexpected and unstoppable, crying for an uncle I'd barely known, and for this creature whose existence rewrote everything I understood about the world, and for the impossible friendship that had flourished in this hidden chamber while the rest of us lived our ordinary lives in ignorant sunshine. I stepped forward without deciding to, drawn by something older than fear, and the Yeti watched my approach with an expression that might have been hope or might have been resignation, one massive hand extending slowly, palm up, in a gesture Samuel must have taught it, or perhaps one it had taught Samuel, an invitation to connection that required trust from both sides of an impossible divide. When my hand touched that palm, feeling warmth and calluses and the trembling of controlled strength, I understood that I had just inherited not merely an estate, but a covenant, a sacred responsibility that Samuel had carried alone for 40 years, and which now passed to me, with all its wonder and terror and moral complexity, binding me to this creature and to a secret that would transform solitude into purpose, privacy into protection, and the remainder of my life into the next chapter of a story that began long before I was born, and whose ending remained unwritten in the darkness beneath the mountain. The hours that followed took on a quality outside normal time, as though the chamber existed in its own temporal dimension, where minutes stretched into significance and silence became its own language. The Yeti, I couldn't continue thinking of it as merely creature or it, when those eyes held such evident personhood, moved with deliberate gentleness through the space, and I began to recognize patterns in the movement, routines that Samuel must have established decades ago, and which had calcified into ritual through repetition and necessity. It would pause at certain locations, touching objects with a tenderness that bordered on reverence, a worn flannel shirt draped over a chair back, a coffee mug still sitting on a makeshift table, a pair of reading glasses folded beside a stack of journals, and each touch was accompanied by that low, mournful sound, a vocalization that fell somewhere between whale song and human grief, resonating in frequencies I felt in my sternum before I heard them with my ears. I found myself mirroring the behavior, picking up Samuel's belongings and holding them as though physical contact could somehow conjure explanation. And when our eyes met across these shared moments of touching my uncle's abandoned life, something passed between us that required no translation, a mutual recognition of loss that transcended species and created the first fragile threads of connection. The Yeti gestured toward the journals stacked beside what I now understood was Samuel's chair, positioned for reading aloud, and the intentionality of the gesture was unmistakable. It wanted me to understand, needed me to know the story that had unfolded in this hidden chamber. I sat in Samuel's chair, feeling the worn cushion still holding the shape of his body, and began reading aloud without consciously deciding to do so, my voice filling the chamber with words my uncle had written 40 years earlier. June 14th, 1983. Found him in a crevasse 3 days north of base camp. Left forearm shattered, infection already spreading. The most magnificent and impossible thing I have ever witnessed. The Yeti moved closer as I read, settling onto the floor, near my feet with remarkable delicacy for something so massive, and I felt the warmth radiating from that great body, smelled the scent that was animal but also distinctly individual, unique as a fingerprint. As I continued through Samuel's account of that first encounter, the decision to help rather than document, to heal rather than capture, to protect rather than reveal, the Yeti responded to certain passages with vocalizations that varied in tone and intensity, and I began to understand these were not random sounds but specific reactions to specific memories, a commentary on the narrative that proved it had been present for these readings before, that Samuel had shared his own journals with the being they documented, creating a feedback loop of story and memory and mutual witnessing. When I reached the passage describing how Samuel had set the broken arm, the Yeti extended that same limb toward me, and I saw the evidence of the old break. the slight misalignment that spoke of healing without proper medical intervention, and understood that I was being shown corroboration, physical proof of the story I was reading, a deliberate effort to bridge my skepticism with evidence. The feeding ritual began near midnight, though time had become meaningless in the chamber's eternal artificial dusk, and I watched as the Yeti moved to the storage area, where Samuel had clearly stockpiled supplies with the precision of someone managing a life support system. It selected items with obvious preference: dried fruits over vegetables, certain grains over others, displaying decision-making that suggested not just appetite, but choice, taste, personal preference developed over years of Samuel offering options and observing responses. I found myself helping without being asked, reading the labels on containers and holding items up for inspection, receiving either subtle nods or gentle head shakes in response, and this simple interaction felt profound in its domesticity. A grocery shopping conversation translated into gesture and conducted between beings who should have had no basis for communication. The Yeti ate with remarkable manners, taking small amounts despite obvious hunger, chewing slowly, pausing between portions as though Samuel had taught table etiquette, or perhaps as though its own culture contained similar social conventions around food and community. When it finished, it brought me items from the same stores, ranging them before me with careful attention, and I understood this was reciprocity, hospitality extended across the species barrier, an invitation to share sustenance that carried all the weight of breaking bread with strangers who might become allies. And as I ate food prepared by my dead uncle and offered by a creature that shouldn't exist, I felt the boundaries of my previous world crumbling into something larger and more terrible and more wonderful than anything my ordinary life had prepared me to comprehend. Before I finally climbed the stairs back to the surface world, the Yeti did something that would haunt me through all the decisions that followed. It took my hand in both of its own, those massive palms engulfing my fingers completely, and pressed my hand against its chest, holding it there above its heart. The beating I felt was slower than human, powerful as distant thunder, and in that moment of forced intimacy I felt not just pulse, but emotion transmitted through flesh and bone, a desperate communication of trust being offered despite every reason for caution, despite a world that had forced it into hiding and a history that justified nothing but suspicion. Its eyes held mine with an intensity that bordered on pleading, and I saw reflected there not an animal seeking survival, but a person asking for understanding, for continued protection, for the covenant Samuel had made to be honored beyond his death. When it finally released my hand, it touched its own chest, then pointed to Samuel's chair, then to me, a sequence that required no interpretation. It was asking if I would return, if I would take Samuel's place, if the story that had sustained it for 40 years would continue into a new chapter or end here. In abandonment and uncertainty, I nodded, not trusting my voice, and the sound it made in response was different from the earlier grief, containing something that might have been relief or might have been hope. And as I climbed back toward the surface, I carried that sound with me like a promise. I wasn't sure I had the strength to keep, but knew I could never bring myself to break. I spent the next 3 days locked in Samuel's study above ground, reading through 40 years of journals while the knowledge of what waited below pressed against my consciousness. Like a physical weight, the entries began with clinical observation measurements, dietary habits, behavioral patterns documented with scientific precision. But as the months of 1983 bled into years, the writing transformed into something closer to conversation, questions posed and somehow answered, philosophical musings about consciousness and loneliness and what constitutes personhood. When traditional definitions prove inadequate, Samuel wrote about teaching the Yeti he never named it, perhaps understanding that naming was a form of possession to understand English not through speech but through patient repetition and gesture, discovering that it already possessed complex language of its own, a combination of vocalization and sign that suggested cultural transmission, learned behavior, civilization. On March 7, 1987, Samuel described the moment he realized he wasn't studying a rare animal but communing with a person from a species humanity had relegated to myth, and the ethical weight of that recognition had nearly broken him. I have condemned him to a life sentence, he wrote in handwriting that deteriorated into desperate scrawl, but the alternative is vivisection disguised as research, captivity called conservation, a existence as laboratory curiosity that would be worse than any death. I tell myself I am protecting him, but some nights I wonder if I am only protecting myself from the guilt of betrayal, using his safety as excuse for my own cowardice in refusing to challenge a world that cannot see wonder without seeking to dissect it. The deeper I read, the more I understood that Samuel hadn't simply kept a secret, he had constructed an entire secondary existence. A double life that required constant vigilance and systematic deception. The supply orders that had eventually triggered federal attention were just the visible surface of an elaborate infrastructure, modified delivery schedules to explain the quantities, a network of suppliers who never compared notes, careful rotation of purchases to avoid pattern recognition, and increasingly sophisticated explanations for why a solitary old man needed industrial amounts of specific provisions. Samuel had calculated caloric requirements, researched nutritional needs based on comparative biology, taught himself veterinary medicine from correspondence courses he took under false names, and gradually transformed from anthropologist to caretaker to something approaching parent or partner, roles that blurred as the years accumulated and the outside world receded into abstraction. He wrote about holidays spent reading aloud for hours, about teaching the Yeti to appreciate music through a salvaged record player, about shared grief when global news penetrated their isolation, and they mourned together for disasters and wars, and the slow grinding destruction of wild places. But threaded through these moments of connection was Samuel's growing awareness of what he had taken, not just freedom, though the Yeti could never safely leave the chamber, but also the possibility of others, of community, of whatever social structures its species might have maintained before humanity's expansion pushed them past the edge of viable existence. The entry from December 24th, 2003, stopped me cold, and I had to read it 3 times before the implications fully registered. He showed me something today that changes everything I thought I understood. Using materials I had brought down over the years, paper, charcoal, objects arranged in sequence, he told me a story, his story, and I finally comprehend that I did not save the last of something, but rather am harboring the witness to an ending, the keeper of memories for a people who chose extinction over exposure. Samuel described images the Yeti had created, crude but unmistakable representations of others like itself, of communities in high caves, of deliberate retreat as human presence expanded, of a collective decision that he could barely comprehend, an entire species choosing to vanish, to let themselves be reduced to legend rather than fight for space in a world that had no room for them. They had not been hunted to extinction or outcompeted by human expansion. They had looked at what was coming, understood the binary choice between discovery and dissolution, and chosen mythology over captivity, preferring to survive only in stories rather than as specimens in humanity's collection of conquered mysteries. The Yeti had been young when it was injured, had wandered too close to human territory against the warnings of its elders, and when Samuel found it, the others had already gone, retreated to wherever final refuges existed, or perhaps simply stopped fighting the cold and hunger, an inevitable ending, and it had survived only to become the last of its kind, the final witness to a civilization that had chosen dignity over survival. I went down to the chamber that night not as visitor, but as supplicant, carrying the weight of what Samuel's journals had revealed, and found the Yeti waiting as though it had known I would come, as though it had been listening to my footsteps above. I went down to the chamber that night, not as visitor but as supplicant, carrying the weight of what Samuel's journals had revealed, and found the Yeti waiting as though it had known I would come, as though it had been listening to my footsteps above and understood that the reading was finished, the history absorbed, the burden now shared between us. It sat in the posture Samuel had sketched dozens of times, back against the stone wall, legs crossed, massive hands resting open on its knees in what I had learned was a gesture of receptivity, of willingness to engage, and its eyes, dark and impossibly deep, tracked my descent with an awareness that made my throat tighten with something beyond fear, something closer to recognition of my own inadequacy before a consciousness I had no framework to properly comprehend. I sat across from it as I had before, but this time I brought one of Samuel's journals, the one from 2003, and opened it to the entry about the drawings, about the choice its people had made, and I did not know if it could read English or if literacy was even a relevant concept, but I needed it to know that I understood, that Samuel had told its story, that the witnessing had been documented even if it could never be publicly shared. The Yeti leaned forward slowly, movement deliberate and careful as though approaching a frightened animal, and reached out one massive hand to touch the journal pages with a gentleness That seemed impossible given the size and obvious strength of those fingers, each thick as a child's wrist and tipped with dark nails worn smooth by decades. In this stone room, it traced the lines of Samuel's handwriting, following the flow of words it might not have been able to read but clearly recognized, and then it made a sound low in its chest that resonated through the chamber and through my own ribcage, a vocalization that Samuel had described as signifying remembrance, mourning, the acknowledgement of absence, and I realized with sudden clarity that it was grieving, not just for Samuel but for all of them, for the others who had chosen to disappear, for the civilization that had unmade itself rather than submit to humanity's documentation. I found myself speaking, without planning to, words spilling out in a whisper that barely qualified as voice. He tried to honor what you were, what you lost. He spent 40 years trying to give you something that might matter, even in captivity. The Yeti's eyes met mine, and in that gaze I saw something Samuel had written about, but I had not fully believed until that moment. Intelligence, yes, but also wisdom, the kind that comes only from surviving your own ending, from being the last and knowing you are the last and continuing anyway, not from hope, but from simple refusal to let the darkness have everything. Over the following days I established a routine that mirrored what Samuel's journals described: bringing food at dawn and dusk, sitting for hours in silence that became its own form of communication, learning to read the subtle shifts in posture and expression that conveyed meaning more efficiently than words ever could. But I also began to see what Samuel's writing had only hinted at, the profound loneliness that permeated every aspect of the Yeti's existence. Despite Samuel's decades of companionship, it would sometimes arrange objects in patterns that I gradually recognized as representation stones for mountains, scraps of fabric for others of its kind, empty spaces for absences that could never be filled, creating and then carefully dismantling scenes from a past that existed now only in its memory, a ritual of remembrance that had to be performed in private because even Samuel, for all his understanding, had been part of the species responsible for making that remembrance necessary. I watched it touch the walls, where Samuel had mounted photographs over the years, landscapes from Tibet and Nepal, high mountain ranges where snow met sky in white infinity, and understood these were not decoration, but windows, attempts to give a horizon to a creature meant for open spaces now confined to stone and artificial light. One evening it retrieved a bundle from behind its sleeping area, unwrapped layers of careful cloth protection, and showed me objects I recognized from Samuel's earliest journal entries: woven items, tools carved from horn and bone, a necklace of stones drilled with holes too precise for natural formation, artifacts of its people's culture, carried all these years in hiding, a museum collection for an audience of one, proof that what had been lost was not primitive or simple, but fully realized, complex, worthy of preservation even when preservation meant only personal memory in absolute isolation. The weight of it broke something in me that I had not known needed breaking, some comfortable assumption about progress and civilization and humanity's right to inherit every corner of existence. And I found myself crying there in the dim chamber while the last of an ancient people watched me, with patient understanding, as though it had seen this realization before in Samuel, as though it knew that true comprehension of what had been sacrificed always led to this grief, this recognition of complicity, even in those of us who never actively participated in the expansion that had pushed mystery off the edge of the possible. The Yeti reached out and placed one massive hand on my shoulder, the weight of it grounding and gentle, and made that sound again, the one meaning remembrance, but directed now at me rather than at absence, acknowledging my witnessing, accepting my inadequate empathy, forgiving me for being human in a world that had no space left for anything that refused to be catalogued, studied, and ultimately controlled. I understood then what Samuel had meant when he wrote about the impossibility of the choice he had made. Keeping this creature hidden was a form of violence, a theft of freedom and possibility, but revealing its existence to a world that viewed mystery only as problems requiring solution would have been an even greater betrayal. And there was no third option, no path that led anywhere except compromise with horror or complicity in ending. We sat together in that knowledge, as the hours passed unmarked, the last keeper of the old pact now gone, and I the accidental inheritor of a responsibility I had never sought and could not refuse, bound now by understanding rather than blood to protect a secret that would die with both of us, that had to die with both of us, because some things were too precious to survive contact with the contemporary world's relentless hunger for explanation. They arrived on a Thursday morning when fog still clung to the mountain ridges, 3 federal vehicles, grinding up the narrow access road with the inevitability of stones rolling downhill. And I knew before they reached the gate that everything Samuel had protected for 40 years was now balanced on the edge of exposure, that the fortress he had built was about to be tested by forces that did not care about sacred promises or ancient grief, only about protocols and jurisdictions and the bureaucratic imperative to investigate anomalies flagged by algorithms designed to detect patterns in supply orders and satellite thermal imaging. I watched from the window as they parked in formation, disembarking with the efficient coordination of people accustomed to enforcing compliance, and recognized among them not just wildlife agents in their official jackets, but others in civilian clothes, who moved with different purpose, whose eyes scanned the property with the hunger of those who hunt not animals but discoveries, validation, proof of theories that would make careers and fill funding gaps and transform mystery into data. The lead agent knocked with authority that assumed cooperation, and when I opened the door I saw in his face a kind of professional courtesy that did not extend to negotiation. They had warrants, documentation, legal authority backed by federal statutes regarding endangered species and potential violations of international wildlife trafficking agreements, and my role here was to comply or be charged with obstruction. And I understood in that moment that Samuel's greatest fear had been realized, not through betrayal or accident, but through the simple mathematical inevitability of patterns noticed by systems designed to notice patterns, surveillance so pervasive it could detect the logistical footprint of hiding something massive and alive in a place that should have been empty. They wanted access to the entire property. They explained with voices trained to sound reasonable even when delivering ultimatums, because satellite data showed thermal signatures inconsistent with a single human occupant, and Samuel's decades of supply orders, the quantities of food, the specialized medical equipment, the requests through obscure channels for items that made sense only if you were maintaining something large and metabolically unique, had triggered investigations that accumulated into this moment, this confrontation, this ending that I was powerless to prevent no matter how desperately I wanted to honor what my uncle had sacrificed everything to protect. I tried delay tactics that fooled no one, claiming I needed to locate keys, that some areas were structurally unsafe after Samuel's death, that the estate was still being processed through probate and perhaps they should coordinate with lawyers. But the lead agent simply handed me additional paperwork that preemptively addressed every objection, and I realized they had been planning this for months, perhaps years, waiting only for Samuel's death to remove the primary obstacle between them and whatever they believed was hidden here. The others had already begun spreading across the property, examining the reinforced structures with professional assessment, photographing the claw marks Samuel had never fully explained away, taking samples from surfaces with swabs and evidence bags, treating the entire place as a crime scene or research site rather than a home. And I felt my chest tightening with panic because downstairs in the hidden chamber the Yeti would be hearing this, the footsteps and voices multiplying above, the disturbance in the routine that had sustained it through decades. And I did not know if it would hide or emerge, or simply wait with that terrible patience for whatever came next. One of the civilian researchers, a woman with credentials from a cryptozoology institute I vaguely recognized from late-night television documentaries, approached me with barely contained excitement badly disguised as scientific objectivity. "We know Samuel was protecting something significant. We have sonar data suggesting underground spaces, thermal readings indicating a large mammalian presence. We're not here to harm anything. This is a conservation matter, a chance to finally verify and protect a species that might be on the edge of extinction. You'd be helping, not betraying." But I heard beneath her practiced reassurance the real message they already knew, or knew enough, and my cooperation was irrelevant except to make the process smoother, faster, less complicated by legal resistance that would only delay the inevitable discovery. I thought of the objects the Yeti had shown me, the artifacts of its vanished people, the ritual arrangements of stones and fabric representing memories that would become museum pieces, or laboratory curiosities, stripped of context and meaning, transformed from sacred history into data points supporting papers about cognitive development in undocumented primate species. I thought of Samuel's journals, still hidden in my room, documenting not just biological observations, but a relationship built on trust and mutual recognition of loss, A 40-year conversation between two beings who had chosen isolation over the violence of exposure. And I knew with sickening certainty that no matter what promises these people made about humane treatment and scientific protection, they could not comprehend what they were about to destroy, could not understand that some forms of survival were indistinguishable from extinction when they required surrender to observation, classification, the reduction of mystery to mechanism. The lead agent was watching me with the expression of someone trained to read resistance, and he spoke with finality that left no room for misunderstanding. We're going to search the property thoroughly, and if there are sealed or hidden areas, we have equipment and authorization to access them. You can guide us, which would minimize damage and demonstrate good faith cooperation, or you can step aside and let us work systematically. But we are going inside, Mr. Harding. The only question is how much of your uncle's property remains intact when we're finished. His hand rested on the radio at his belt, a casual gesture that carried implicit threat. More people could arrive, more resources could be deployed. Escalation was always an option if I chose to make this difficult, and I was alone here at the edge of the world, with no allies and no strategy, facing the machinery of institutional authority with nothing but a promise I had inherited from a dead man and a creature downstairs that trusted me because it had no other choice, because I was all that stood between it and a world that would celebrate its discovery, without ever understanding what that discovery would cost. The woman researcher had moved to the entrance, examining the doorframe with attention that suggested she recognized reinforcement when she saw it, and she called back to the others with barely suppressed triumph. Modified structure here, extensive interior fortification. This isn't normal residential construction. Someone built this place to contain something or keep something out, and given the supply patterns and thermal data, I think we all know which scenario we're looking at. They began gathering near the entrance with equipment, thermal cameras, sonar units, tools for accessing sealed spaces, and I felt time collapsing into this single moment of decision. The choice Samuel had spent 40 years avoiding now falling to me after only weeks in this place. Days of sitting with the Yeti in that underground chamber. Hours of reading about the impossible promise made on a Himalayan slope when my uncle was young, and still believed that love and secrecy might be enough to protect something precious from a world that consumed every mystery it encountered. I could still refuse, force them to cut through walls and break down barriers, by perhaps hours of additional time, but guarantee maximum disruption, and eliminate any possibility of controlling how the discovery unfolded. Or I could guide them, attempt to mediate the encounter, try desperately to advocate for gentle treatment, even knowing that gentleness was not really possible when you were transforming a person into a specimen, a relationship into a research opportunity, a sacred trust into a conservation success story that would be celebrated by everyone, except those who understood what had actually been lost. The lead agent was waiting for my answer, patient but immovable, and behind him I could see the others readying their equipment, and below us in the darkness of the hidden chamber I knew the Yeti was listening, perhaps understanding better than I did that this moment had always been inevitable, that Samuel's death had started a clock that was always going to reach this hour, that the old pact was ending not through choice but through the simple fact that secrets this profound could not survive contact with systems designed to eliminate every remaining space where the unknown might hide from documentation, analysis, and ultimate translation into knowledge that destroyed the very thing it claimed to preserve. I led them downstairs because there was no alternative that did not end in violence or forced entry, but I asked for one condition that surprised them, with its specificity that only 3 people enter initially, that they leave weapons and restrained equipment outside, that they approach slowly and allow the creature to assess them before they made any attempt at contact. And I watched the lead agent exchange glances with the researcher woman before agreeing with reluctance that suggested they thought I was stalling or delusional, but were willing to humor reasonable requests. That did not substantially delay their objectives. We descended the concealed staircase, me first, then the agent, then the woman, then a videographer who documented everything with practiced detachment, and I felt each step downward as betrayal, as the physical manifestation of breaking Samuel's trust, even though I told myself I had no real choice, that they would have found the chamber regardless, that perhaps by guiding them I could somehow influence what happened next. The Yeti was not hiding when we reached the bottom, was not cowering or aggressive, but sitting in the center of the space surrounded by the artifacts it had been arranging for days. The stones and fabric and small bones positioned in patterns Samuel's journals had identified as funeral preparations, mourning rituals from a culture that no longer existed except in this one remaining consciousness. And when it looked at me specifically, with those amber eyes that held 40 years of Samuel's promises, I felt the full weight of what I had just done, the magnitude of the choice that was not really a choice. And I saw in its expression not fear or anger, but a kind of resigned understanding, as if it had always known this moment would arrive and had been preparing for it with the same inevitability that Samuel had prepared for death. The videographer gasped audibly, the camera trembling in hands suddenly shaking with adrenaline or wonder or fear, and the researcher woman made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, the reaction of someone whose entire career had been validated in a single moment, whose theories were being confirmed by the living evidence. Sitting calmly in candlelight 20 feet away, and the lead agent reached slowly for his radio before I grabbed his wrist and said with intensity, "That surprised us both. Not yet, please. Just wait. Just give this a moment before you call in everyone else and turn this into a circus. Just let us understand what we're seeing before we destroy it." With our understanding, the Yeti began to move then, not toward us or away, but performing the ritual I had read about in Samuel's most recent entries, the farewell ceremony, that folklore described as the parting gift of the mountain spirits when they withdrew from the world of humans, and it gathered the stones in sequence, touching each one to its chest before placing them in a specific arrangement while making sounds that were not quite language but carried unmistakable meaning, rhythm and intention and grief woven into vocalizations that resonated in the stone chamber like music from an instrument that no longer had any players, except this one, this last keeper of traditions that would die when it died, that would become academic footnotes and cultural reconstruction attempts, but never again be lived. Knowledge passed between generations who understood their significance. The woman was crying openly now, not with joy but with something more complex. Perhaps the realization that discovery and destruction were sometimes the same act. That by confirming the Yeti's existence we were simultaneously ending whatever form of existence it had maintained here in secret. That scientific validation was a kind of violence no matter how careful and well-intentioned the validators believed themselves to be. The ritual lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though time felt distorted in that space, and when it was complete the Yeti moved to the wall where Samuel's photographs hung and touched each one with a gentleness that made clear it understood exactly what it was losing, who I had brought into this sanctuary, and what that intrusion meant for the fragile equilibrium that had sustained it through decades of isolation. Then it turned to me and made a sound I had never heard before, complex and questioning, and I understood that it was asking me something fundamental, offering me perhaps a final chance to choose differently, to honor Samuel's pact in some way I had not yet imagined. And I stood paralyzed between the creature that trusted me and the officials who represented law and order and the institutional machinery that could not be stopped once it had been set in motion. The lead agent spoke then with voice that tried for gentleness but carried the firmness of inevitable process. "We need to call this in now, establish proper containment protocols, get veterinary and primatology specialists here to assess health status and determine appropriate care facilities. This animal is obviously intelligent and appears calm, but it's also potentially dangerous and definitely needs professional evaluation and protection under endangered species provisions." But I heard beneath his words the translation into reality: tranquilizer darts and transport cages, research facilities and observation protocols, a life lived behind glass or in controlled habitats while teams studied everything that made it unique. Everything that Samuel had understood could not survive that kind of attention, that kind of care that was indistinguishable from captivity no matter what comforting names they gave it. The Yeti was still watching me, waiting, and I saw in its posture an echo of the young creature Samuel had described in his earliest journal entries, wounded and trusting, choosing to believe that this human might be different from the others who had hunted and killed its family, might be capable of understanding that some beings needed to remain hidden not from cowardice, but from a wisdom older than modern curiosity. And I realized that I was being offered the same choice Samuel had faced on that mountainside 40 years ago: to protect, or to expose, to honor mystery, or to surrender it to forces that promised preservation but delivered only transformation into something manageable, knowable, safe. The researcher woman had moved closer, was reaching slowly toward the Yeti with hand extended in gesture that might have been greeting or might have been the first step toward capture, and the creature looked from her to me and back again. And I understood that whatever I did in the next few seconds would define not just its future, but my own, would determine whether I became another keeper of the old pact or the one who finally broke it, whether Samuel's 40-year sacrifice meant anything, or was just postponement of an inevitable ending that I was now delivering with my weakness, my inability to imagine any alternative to cooperation with the official processes that had found us despite every precaution, every reinforced door, every year of careful silence that had not been careful enough to evade the patient accumulation of data patterns that had led these people to this moment, to this choice, to this threshold where I stood knowing that there was no good answer, but only variations of loss, and that whatever I decided would haunt me for whatever years remained after this day ended, and the consequences of my decision became irreversibly real. I stepped forward before the agent could respond, positioning myself between the woman's reaching hand and the Yeti, and I spoke directly to the creature with voice that trembled but carried conviction born from reading every page of Samuel's journals, from understanding that this moment had been described in folklore long before I arrived. Show them what Samuel wrote about, what he witnessed in the last weeks, what he told me only you could decide to share. The Yeti's eyes held mine for 3 heartbeats, and I saw calculation there, ancient weighing of risks and outcomes. The intelligence Samuel had documented across decades distilled into a single moment of choice. And then it moved to the corner where the oldest artifacts were kept, objects Samuel had identified as belonging to the creature's family, to the group that had been hunted and scattered across the mountains until only this one remained, carrying memories and traditions that would otherwise vanish completely from the world. It lifted a carved stone that Samuel's notes described as a teaching object, something used to pass knowledge between generations, and it began the ceremony he had witnessed only twice, the ritual of willing departure, the formal severance of connection between the mountain spirits and the human world that folklore claimed happened when trust became impossible, when the cost of proximity exceeded the value of coexistence, when ancient beings chose dignified withdrawal over diminished survival in a world that had no space left for mystery. The agent moved to stop what he perceived as distress behavior, but I blocked him with outstretched arm and whispered with urgency that finally conveyed the gravity of what we were witnessing. This is not fear, this is decision. This is what happens when we force beings to choose between capture and autonomy. And if you interrupt this, you will never understand what you actually found here. What Samuel protected, what we are losing by turning it into data. The ritual intensified as the Yeti ranged the final objects, moving with purpose that suggested choreography remembered across generations, and it vocalized sounds that built in complexity until the chamber resonated with harmonics that seemed impossible from a single throat, frequencies that made the candles flicker and raised every hair on my body with sensation. That was not quite fear, but recognition of something profound occurring, something that transcended the categories we used to make sense of animal behavior or cultural practice or any framework we brought to contain what we could not understand without diminishing. The researcher woman had lowered her hand and was recording audio with expression transformed from excitement to something closer to grief, perhaps understanding that her life's work had culminated in documenting an ending rather than a beginning, that the validation she sought carried a price that academic training had never prepared her to calculate, that some discoveries destroyed the very thing they confirmed. The Yeti touched each photograph of Samuel again, a farewell that acknowledged decades of companionship, of daily care and conversation, and the profound loneliness they had shared in this hidden space. And then it turned to the wall behind the altar and pushed against a section that I had assumed was solid stone, but which slid aside to reveal a passage leading further into the mountain, a tunnel that Samuel's journals had never mentioned, a final secret within secrets. The agent started forward with professional instinct toward containment and control, but the Yeti moved to the threshold of that passage and performed a gesture that Samuel had described only once, in an entry marked with unusual emphasis, the gesture of formal absolution, of releasing someone from a promise they could no longer keep, of acknowledging that circumstances had changed beyond the ability of intention or loyalty to preserve what had been, and I understood that it was freeing me from Samuel's pact, recognizing that I had tried and failed, that the modern world had found us despite everything, and that it was choosing the only freedom that remained. It looked at each of us in turn, the agent whose radio was finally crackling with incoming messages demanding status updates, The woman whose tears fell silently as she recorded everything. The videographer whose camera had captured proof that would change cryptozoology and folklore studies and everything we thought we knew about what survived in the hidden places. And finally me, Samuel's nephew, who had inherited a promise too large for my courage or imagination. And in that final look I saw not accusation, but gratitude, acknowledgement that I had at least hesitated, had at least questioned, had at least understood enough to give it time for the ceremony. This formal ending that preserved some measure of dignity in what was ultimately inevitable. Then it stepped backward into the passage, moving with surprising speed for something so massive, and the stone door began closing with grinding sound of mechanisms Samuel must have installed. One final protection, one last threshold we could not cross because it sealed from the other side. And the agent lunged forward too late as the passage disappeared back into apparent solidity, leaving us standing in the chamber surrounded by artifacts and photographs and the lingering resonance of vocalizations that still seemed to vibrate in the stone walls. The researcher woman played back her audio recording with shaking hands, confirming that everything had been documented, that proof existed even if the creature did not. And the agent was already on his radio calling for ground-penetrating radar and drilling equipment and structural engineers who could find where that passage led, where the tunnel emerged, how far into the mountain it extended before ending in some final sanctuary, or some exit that would allow the last Yeti to disappear into terrain too vast and remote for even modern technology to search completely. And I stood there knowing that I had both honored and broken Samuel's promise, that I had given the creature a choice even as I had destroyed its security, that I was now part of a story that would be told in conflicting versions depending on who needed to justify their actions, their presence, their role in the moment when mystery chose to withdraw rather than submit to our need to know, to categorize, to preserve things by transforming them into something preservable. The agent organized search teams, while the woman cataloged everything in the chamber with methodical attention to detail that seemed like grief processed through professional discipline. And I sat among the artifacts the Yeti had left behind. Objects that would become museum pieces or research materials, but would never again serve their original purpose, never again carry living meaning exchanged between beings who understood their significance. And I picked up the carved teaching stone and felt its weight, and wondered if somewhere in the mountain passages the last keeper of the old pact was still moving deeper into darkness, still carrying traditions and memories and knowledge that would die when it died, that we had simultaneously confirmed and ensured would disappear. That our discovery had not saved, but had instead accelerated toward extinction by making continued hidden existence impossible. Samuel's final journal entry was in my pocket, the one I had not shown the agents, the one that described this exact scenario with prophetic clarity. And in it he had written that the Yeti had always known this day would come, had always understood that human curiosity was patient and technology was relentless, and that no secret could be kept forever, and that its people had chosen long ago to diminish and disappear rather than adapt to a world that had no space for what they were, that the ritual of willing departure was not surrender, but the exercise of the last freedom, available to beings who refused to become specimens, refused to exchange mystery for protected captivity, refused to let their existence be validated by the very forces that made unobserved existence impossible. 3 months passed before the Federal Wildlife Service closed their investigation, and I received the final report at my apartment in the city where I had tried to return to normal life, tried to pretend that nothing in the Himalayan darkness had changed me. Fundamentally, the document was clinical and thorough, explaining that ground-penetrating radar had revealed tunnel networks extending 17 miles into the mountain, connecting to caves that showed evidence of habitation but no current occupants, and that despite deploying thermal imaging drones and bringing in tracking specialists from 3 countries, no trace of the creature had been found beyond the chamber where I had last seen it step backward into darkness, as though it had simply ceased to exist the moment it passed beyond our ability to observe and measure and confirm. The agent who had led the operation included a personal note stating that the case remained technically open, but that resources were being redirected, that the physical evidence and recordings provided sufficient documentation for their purposes, and that I was no longer considered a person of interest, though I should expect occasional follow-up inquiries as analyses continued. But it was the researcher woman's letter that arrived separately that told me what the report had omitted, what had happened in the weeks after I had been sent home, What they had found in the deepest chamber at the end of those 17 miles of ancient passages, that the Yeti had traveled in its final journey away from human reach. They had discovered it. 3 weeks into the search, she wrote, in a cavern that showed evidence of being a sacred site. Walls covered in the same symbols that had marked Samuel's basement. The floor ranged with objects that suggested ceremony or memorial or some practice. We had no framework to interpret correctly. The Yeti had been there, she confirmed, but not alive, not preserved, not available for the study and documentation she had spent her career preparing to conduct, because it had completed the ritual of willing departure exactly as folklore described, as Samuel's journals had documented from second-hand observation, as the creature had somehow communicated would happen if its sanctuary was violated beyond the possibility of continued hidden existence. The medical examiner they had brought in could find no physiological cause of death, no disease or injury or age-related failure that explained why a creature that Samuel's records indicated had been healthy days before had simply stopped living, and the woman wrote that she had argued strenuously against the official conclusion of stress-induced cardiac event, had insisted that what they had witnessed was something closer to choice, to the exercise of will over biological imperative, to a decision that Western science struggled to acknowledge as possible, but that dozens of cultural traditions described as the prerogative of beings who understood existence differently than we did. She told me that she had resigned from the research institute rather than participate in the autopsy, that she could not be part of the process that would reduce the last Yeti to tissue samples and skeletal measurements and genetic sequencing that would answer questions about evolutionary biology while completely missing what mattered, what we had lost, what Samuel had tried to prevent by dedicating 40 years to keeping one promise in a world that made promise-keeping nearly impossible. Her letter included photographs she had taken before leaving the final chamber, images that showed the Yeti arranged in a posture that suggested peace rather than distress, surrounded by the objects it had carried from Samuel's basement through 17 miles of darkness to die among the symbols of its people, its family, the traditions it had been the last living keeper of. And in those photographs I recognized items from Samuel's personal collection, a watch he wore in early entries, a photograph of his late wife, a carved figure I had seen on his desk, objects the creature had taken not as theft but as connection, as memorial, as the building of relationship across the boundary that separated species and understanding, and the loneliness both beings must have felt in their hidden existence. The woman wrote that she believed the Yeti had known Samuel was dying long before it happened, that the journal suggested behavioral changes in the weeks before Samuel's death that indicated grief or preparation, and that perhaps the creature had only waited long enough after Samuel's passing to ensure that someone would witness the ceremony, that their story would be told even if incompletely, that the ritual of willing departure would be documented so that when the last Yeti vanished from the world someone would understand it as choice rather than extinction, as dignity rather than defeat, as the final gesture of beings who had decided that invisible existence was preferable to observed survival, that some mysteries maintained their sacred nature only by remaining forever just beyond the reach of those who needed to solve them. I returned to Samuel's mountain house one final time before it was sold, and I walked the property at dusk and heard nothing but wind and the distant sounds of a world that had moved on from the brief excitement of cryptozoological discovery, that had processed the proof of the Yeti's existence through news cycles and documentaries and academic papers, until the wonder was domesticated into fact, the mystery reduced to footnote in zoological classification. I stood in the empty basement where the chamber had been sealed by federal order, where the artifacts had been removed to climate-controlled storage facilities, where nothing remained of 40 years of daily care and cross-species companionship except scratches in the stone, and the faint smell of the candles Samuel had burned. And I understood finally what he had been protecting, not just the creature but the relationship, not just the secret but the space where two profoundly lonely beings had built something that could not survive documentation, that existed only in the daily rituals of care and attention, and the promise that some connections mattered more than the world's need to know, to catalog, to make sense of everything by destroying the conditions that allowed mystery to flourish. I placed my hand on the sealed wall and felt the cold stone and thought about the Yeti moving through darkness toward its chosen ending, carrying Samuel's watch and photograph, and I wondered if that was what love looked like between beings who shared only loneliness, and the knowledge that the modern world had no space for what they were, and whether Samuel's 40 years had been tragedy or the most successful relationship. Either of them could have hoped for given the circumstances of their impossible existence. What secrets do we destroy by insisting everything must be known? And who decides which mysteries deserve to remain hidden? Subscribe to hear more stories where the ancient world confronts our need to illuminate everything we fear or cannot understand.